Ask almost anyone to name the greatest empire of the ancient world, and you'll almost always get the same answer. Rome. The legions, the roads, the aqueducts, the arenas. An emperor in purple, ruling 60 million people, from a city of 1 million, the largest, richest, most advanced state on earth. Here is the part nobody mentions. It was not the only one. It was probably not the largest. And in a number of things that actually matter, how it counted its own people, how it chose the men who ran it, what it could make out of iron, it was not the most advanced either. Because at the exact moment Rome reached that peak, at the other end of the world, there was a second empire, the same size, the same wealth, with its own paved roads, its own tax registers, and its own professional civil service, Han China. Between the two of them, close to half of everyone alive on Earth. And here is the detail that should tell you how lopsided this comparison really is. Rome never knew how many people it ruled. Historians still argue about it in ranges of tens of millions. In the year 2 after Christ, the Han counted theirs, household by household, for tax, and wrote the number down, 57,671,400. So, did the two halves of the world ever meet? They knew about each other. They traded with each other in enormous quantities for 400 years. They never met. Not one confirmed embassy, not one confirmed traveler who made the whole journey in either direction in 4 centuries. Roman glass has been dug out of Chinese tombs and Chinese silk out of graves in the Syrian desert. The parcels arrived. The postman never did. But they came close, closer than you would believe. A Chinese ambassador was sent west with orders to reach Rome, and he got within a few weeks of a Roman province, and then he turned round and went home. He had been told something on that shore. It was a lie. We have the exact words of it, and we know who profited from him believing them. Men walked into a Chinese port, claiming to carry tribute from the Emperor of Rome, and the officials who received them wrote down precisely what those men were carrying. It is the wrong cargo. And out in the deserts of western China there is a village with a Roman name, a statue of a legionary standing in it, and people who will tell you exactly whose descendants they are. There is a serious scholar behind that claim, and a genetics lab against it, and it does not end the way you are expecting. 3 doors. We are going to explore all of them. But first, look at the two of them together, because almost nobody ever does, and the scale of it is the thing that makes the rest of this story ache. Put them on the same map, at the same scale, in the same year, and take the year 150 after Christ. In the West, the Roman Empire wraps the entire Mediterranean, from the moors north of York to the edge of the Sahara, from the Atlantic coast of Portugal to the upper Euphrates. 5 million square kilometers of governed land, roughly 60 million people, though Rome could only estimate. Now go east, past the Euphrates, past the Persian Plateau, past the mountains, and keep going and going. 4,000 kilometers later, on the far side of the largest continent on Earth, the Han Empire holds the eastern quarter of Asia, from the edge of the steppe down to the coast of Vietnam. From the sea in the east, out along a thin corridor of oases, pointing west into the desert, comparable in size, comparable in wealth. Its census said 57,671,400 people. And between them, filling the entire middle of the map, is everybody else. Parthia, then Persia, holding Iran and Mesopotamia, the Kushans across Bactria and northern India, the Sogdian merchant cities, the oasis kingdoms of the Tarim Basin, the Xiongnu and their successors on the grass, to the north of all of it. Now draw the road, because it does exist. A line of caravan routes and passes and river valleys running from the Chinese frontier at the Jade Gate, across Central Asia, through Persia, to the Mediterranean coast, and a second route by sea from southern China around India to the Red Sea and into Egypt. Both of them worked. Both were used, every single year, for centuries. The distance from Rome to the Han capital is a little over 8,000 kilometers in a straight line, and the road, which does not run straight, is closer to 11,000. On foot, with a caravan, at the pace the ancient world actually moved, that is not a journey of weeks. It is a year, at best, one way, if nothing goes wrong. And that gap in the middle of the map, the space between the two of them, is what this entire video is about. Because the goods crossed it every year in both directions, and the people did not. Before we go further, a like and a subscribe genuinely decide whether long documentaries like this keep getting made. And if you can see the hype button, press it. It costs you nothing, and it pushes a video like this hard. And here is the number I want in the comments before we start. Across the 400 years this video covers, how many individual people do you think we can actually confirm made the entire journey between the Roman world and China, end to end, in either direction? Not goods, people. Write your guess down now, and I will give you the real answer at the end, and I do not think you are going to like it. Now, to feel what nearly happened here, you have to watch the two of them grow up, side by side, because they did it at the same time and they did it in the same order, and the coincidences are going to get uncomfortable very quickly. Start in the 220s before Christ, and start with Rome, where things are not going well. In the year 218 before Christ, a Carthaginian general named Hannibal crossed the Alps into Italy with an army and elephants and began systematically destroying every Roman force sent against him. At Lake Trasimene, he ambushed and annihilated an entire consular army. At Cannae, in 216, he encircled the largest army Rome had ever put in the field and killed something like 50,000 men in a single afternoon, which remains one of the deadliest days in the history of warfare. Rome at this point is not an empire. It is a middling Italian republic fighting for its existence against a superior general who is camped inside its own country, and it survives essentially by refusing to accept that it has lost, raising army after army, and grinding the war out over 16 years until Scipio takes the fight to Africa. Now go east and look at what is happening in the same decade on the other side of the world. In the year 221 before Christ, 3 years before Hannibal crossed the Alps, the king of the western Chinese state of Qin completed the conquest of every rival kingdom in the Chinese world and made himself the first ruler of a unified China. He took a new title for it, First Emperor, and what he did next is the most aggressive act of state building in the ancient world. He abolished the old aristocratic kingdoms and replaced them with commanderies run by appointed officials. He standardized the written script so that a document from one end of the empire could be read at the other. He standardized weights, measures, and coinage. He standardized the axle width of carts so that wheel ruts everywhere would match. He connected and extended the northern frontier walls into a single defensive line. He built himself a tomb guarded by an army of 8,000 life-sized terracotta soldiers, each with an individual face, which nobody would see again for 2,000 years, until a farmer digging a well hit one. He also burned books, buried scholars, worked hundreds of thousands of conscripts to death on his projects, and spent his last years hunting for an elixir of immortality, which some accounts say killed him, because it contained mercury. And here is the thing to hold on to. His dynasty, the one that was supposed to last 10,000 generations, lasted 15 years. He died in 210. The empire exploded into rebellion within a year, and by 206, the Qin were gone. So watch what these two states are doing at the same moment. Rome is being taught by Hannibal that a republic of citizen soldiers can absorb catastrophe and keep going. China is being taught by the first emperor that a unified empire is possible, that it can be administered by professionals rather than aristocrats, and that a regime, which is nothing but force and machinery, will tear itself apart in a generation. Both lessons stick. Both are load-bearing for the next 400 years. And then, in the year 202 before Christ, on the same calendar, two things happen. In North Africa, near a town called Zama, Scipio meets Hannibal in the field and beats him, and the Second Punic War ends, and Carthage is finished as a power. And Rome is left as the unchallenged master of the Western Mediterranean and on the road to everything that comes after. And in China, a former village official and minor police officer named Liu Bang, who had joined the rebellion against the Qin, who was famously coarse, illiterate in the scholarly sense, and reportedly urinated in a Confucian scholar's ceremonial hat to make a point, defeated his last rival and took the throne, and founded the Han dynasty. The same year, 2,000 miles of ocean, desert, mountain, and steppe apart, in a world where neither event could possibly be known to the other. The Western Mediterranean and Eastern Asia each produced the state that would define the next 4 centuries within months of each other. And what Liu Bang did with his victory is the second half of that lesson. He kept the Qin machine, the commanderies, the officials, the law codes, the standardization, all of it, and he softened it. He cut taxes and forced labor, made a public show of humility, and adopted a philosophy of government that said the ruler's job was to leave people alone as much as possible. He kept the engine and removed the cruelty. That combination, a professional imperial machine wrapped in a moral justification for holding power, is the Han, and it is going to run for 400 years. Which brings us to the question that decides everything about how these two empires actually behaved and where they are wildly different. How do you govern 60 million people at ancient speeds when a message takes a month to cross your own territory? Rome's answer was to barely govern at all, and to be brilliant at it. The Roman Empire at its height was administered by a startlingly small number of people, a few hundred senior officials for the entire thing. A province the size of modern France might be run by a governor, a handful of senior staff, some financial officers, and the army. There was no Roman civil service in the sense you would recognize. What there was instead was cities. Rome's method was to find or found a city in every region, hand local government to the wealthy men of that city, and let them run everything, collect the taxes, maintain the roads, judge the small cases, and pay for the public buildings out of their own pockets in exchange for status, honors, and eventually Roman citizenship. It was outsourced government. It cost the central state almost nothing, and it worked so well that in many provinces, the empire is best understood not as a bureaucracy, but as a protection racket with excellent infrastructure and a very good legal system attached. And that legal system is Rome's masterpiece. Roman law, which developed over centuries as a body of case reasoning and jurists' opinion, is the most exportable thing the empire produced, and it is the foundation of the legal codes of most of Europe and Latin America today. Rome also built the physical layer, 80,000 kilometers of engineered road, aqueducts, delivering water on a scale not matched again until the 19th century, and concrete, which the Romans understood better than anyone would until modern times. Han China's answer was the opposite in every respect, and it is the thing that most surprises people who have only been taught the Western half of this story. The Han governed through an actual bureaucracy, structured in tiers, from the imperial court down through commanderies to counties to districts, staffed by salaried officials who were graded, inspected, promoted, demoted, and rotated. They were deliberately posted away from their home regions so that they could not build local power bases, and they were subject to a censorate, an entire branch of government, whose job was to investigate and impeach other officials, including at the highest level. And the recruitment is the part that should stop you. Officials were selected partly by recommendation from local worthies, and partly, and increasingly, by examination on a canon of classical texts, with the Imperial Academy training candidates in the capital, its student body running into the tens of thousands by the 2nd century after Christ. The idea that positions of power in the state should be awarded on the basis of a competitive written examination in which the candidate's family does not appear on the paper existed in China 2,000 years ago. Europe did not adopt it until the 19th century, and when Britain reformed its civil service in the 1850s, the Chinese examination system was explicitly among the models cited. Rome selected its governing class by birth, wealth, and patronage. China selected a large and growing part of its governing class by exam. That single difference explains most of what follows. And now go back to that number I gave you at the start, because this is where it comes from and this is what it actually means. In the year 2 after Christ, the Han bureaucracy counted the entire empire, household by household, for taxation and conscription, filed up the chain, compiled at the capital, and preserved 57,671,400 people. And the figure underneath it, which is the one that tells you what kind of state this was, 12,233,000 and 62 households. Compare that to Rome, where modern historians argue about the total population in ranges of tens of millions, because Rome counted citizens for its own purposes and never attempted a full imperial headcount. To produce the Han number, you need a literate official in every county using the same script, working to the same schedule, supervised by people who will be punished if the numbers are wrong. That census is not a statistic. It is an X-ray of the state. The same machine ran the economy directly. In 117 before Christ, the Han nationalized the production of salt and iron, taking two of the most profitable industries in the empire into state hands to pay for a war. And 36 years later, in 81 before Christ, the court held a formal public debate about whether to reverse it between the government's finance ministers and a delegation of Confucian scholars arguing for the merchants. Somebody transcribed it. It survives under the title Discourses on Salt and Iron, and reading it is uncanny because it is a genuine ancient argument between state control and free enterprise, in which both sides make points you could hear on television tonight. And then there is the technology, which is where the gap really opens. Han China was producing cast iron in industrial quantities from blast furnaces more than 1,000 years before Europe managed the same trick in state foundries, turning out plowshares, tools, and weapons, using double-acting bellows, and, at some sites, water-powered hammers. It had the crossbow in mass production, with bronze trigger mechanisms made to such consistent tolerances that a broken one could be repaired with parts taken from another, which is interchangeable manufacturing. A concept the West rediscovered in the 18th century. It had the seed drill and the moldboard plow, which together roughly doubled agricultural efficiency, and which Europe adopted in the 1700s. It had the wheelbarrow, the stern-mounted rudder, the suspension bridge, and the first seismoscope, a bronze instrument that dropped a ball from a dragon's mouth in the direction of a distant earthquake. And around the year 105 after Christ, a court eunuch named Cai Lun formalized and improved a process for making paper from bark, hemp, rags, and fishing nets, and presented it to the emperor. Rome ran on papyrus, which grows in one place on earth, and on parchment, which requires killing animals. China had cheap, mass-producible writing material 1,000 years before the West, and it is not a coincidence that China also had the world's first printing and the world's first paper money. I am not doing this to score points. I am doing it because you cannot feel this story unless you accept that the thing at the other end of the road was not an exotic, distant kingdom. It was a peer, and in several respects, it was ahead. And put the capitals side by side, because it is the fastest way to see the difference in temperament. Rome by the 2nd century was a city of roughly 1 million people, fed by grain fleets from Egypt and North Africa, watered by aqueducts delivering hundreds of thousands of cubic meters a day. And it had grown organically for 800 years into a labyrinth that no one had planned. The Han capitals, Chang'an first and later Luoyang, were the same scale of achievement executed from the opposite philosophy. They were designed. Walled in rammed earth, oriented to the compass, divided into gated residential wards that were closed and patrolled at night, with the palaces in ritually prescribed positions and the markets in designated quarters under government supervision, with several 100,000 people inside the walls and more outside them. One city is a thing that happened. The other is a thing that was drawn. And there is one small administrative detail that makes them feel like the same species of animal. Both empires ran a state postal relay, stations at fixed intervals along the trunk roads with fresh horses, fodder, and lodging, reserved for official traffic, moving government dispatches at speeds no private traveler could match. In Rome, it was the cursus publicus. In China, it was a system of relay stations and courier posts that the Han inherited from the Qin and expanded. Two empires 5,000 miles apart, each independently invented the express post, and neither had any idea the other had done it. So that is the machinery on both sides. Now here is the enemy that neither machine could solve, and it is the same enemy, and it is the reason this whole story eventually happens at all. North of both empires there is grass, a single belt of open steppe running virtually unbroken from the plains of Hungary across the Black Sea, north of the Caspian, over Central Asia and out to Manchuria. Thousands of kilometers of grazing land that supports no cities and no farms, and therefore no tax base and no capital city to capture. What it supports is horses and people who live on them. For an agricultural empire, this is the unsolvable strategic problem, and it works the same way at both ends of the world. Your enemy has no fields to burn, no towns to besiege, and no government to depose. He can move 3 times as fast as your army. He can raid your richest provinces and be gone before your response arrives, and if you march out to punish him, he simply withdraws into a grassland the size of Europe, waits until your supply runs out, and follows you home. You cannot conquer him, because there is nothing to hold. You cannot ignore him, because he is on your border, and your border is where your food is grown. China had this problem first, and it had it worse, and its enemy had a name and a state. The Xiongnu were a confederation of steppe peoples north of the Gobi, unified under a supreme ruler called the Qian at almost exactly the same moment the Qin unified China, which is not a coincidence. Because a large centralized China pressing north is precisely the pressure that forces scattered steppe tribes to combine. They had a court, a hierarchy of kings of the left and the right, a tribute system of their own, and an army of mounted archers. And in the year 200 before Christ, Liu Bang, 2 years into founding the Han dynasty, took an army of over 300,000 men north to settle the Xiongnu problem permanently, and was drawn forward with his vanguard, cut off from his infantry, and surrounded on a mountain called Baideng for 7 days in winter. The founder of the Han dynasty, trapped, with his army freezing, and according to the tradition he got out only by sending a bribe and a flattering message to the Qianyu's principal wife. What followed is the policy that defines the next 60 years, and it is called heqin, which means harmonious kinship, and what it actually meant was tribute. Every year, China sent north fixed quantities of silk, grain, wine, and cash, plus, periodically, an imperial princess as a bride for the Qianyu. In exchange, the Xiongnu mostly refrained from large-scale raiding. The Han court dressed it up in the language of family and marriage alliance, and every official involved knew exactly what it was, and the debates at court about it are sharp and unhappy and go on for decades. Now hold that image, and go west. Rome's northern frontier ran along the Rhine and the Danube, and beyond it were the Germanic peoples, who were not steppe nomads but who presented Rome with a version of the same insoluble problem, an enemy and country not worth conquering, who could not be permanently defeated. And Rome's solution, for centuries, alongside the legions, was money. Subsidies to friendly kings, payments to tribes to keep other tribes off, trade privileges, gifts, and eventually outright annual payments, which Roman writers described with elaborate euphemism and which the recipients understood perfectly well. And in the 5th century, when Attila's Huns extracted rising annual payments in gold from Constantinople, the arrangement was, in every meaningful respect, heqin. 2 empires, on opposite sides of the world, arrived independently at the same policy, gave it a dignified name, and were embarrassed about it in the same way. They also arrived at the same physical answer. Everyone knows Hadrian's Wall, 80 Roman miles of stone across northern Britain with its forts and mile castles. Fewer people know that the Han built far more wall than that. The Qin had linked the older northern frontier walls, and the Han extended the system westwards along the Hexi corridor out into the desert, rammed earth ramparts, watchtowers and beacon stations running for hundreds of kilometers past Dunhuang to the Jade Gate, garrisoned by soldiers whose duty, rosters, and supply requisitions and letters home have been dug out of the dry sand and are readable today. And the purpose of both walls is the same, and it is not what people usually assume. Neither wall was primarily meant to stop an army. An army can concentrate and get over any wall. What a wall does is stop small mounted parties from crossing casually, force traffic through gates where it can be watched and taxed, give you a raised road along your frontier so your own troops can move faster than the raiders, and, critically, stop the raiders getting back out with cattle and captives, because a horseman driving stolen livestock cannot cross a ditch and a rampart. A frontier wall is not a barrier. It is a customs post, a communications route, and a filter. Both empires worked that out. Neither knew the other had. Now here is the fork in this chapter, and it matters, because this is the moment where one empire decides to accept the situation and the other decides to end it. And the decision by the Eastern one is what eventually creates the road that this entire video is about. In the year 141 before Christ, a 16-year-old boy came to the Han throne, and he reigned for 54 years, and he is known as Emperor Wu, the martial emperor. He inherited a treasury full of money from 2 generations of cautious government, and he inherited the tribute policy, and he regarded it as a national humiliation, and he ended it. What followed was decades of offensive war against the Xiongnu, on a scale China had never attempted. Deep cavalry campaigns out into the steppe, hundreds of thousands of horses, colossal expenditure. It broke the Xiongnu Confederation in the end, and split it, and pushed Chinese power out into Central Asia for the first time in history. It also bankrupted the state. This is the war the salt and iron monopolies were created to pay for. It is the war that caused currency debasement, forced contributions from merchants, the sale of offices and titles, and a level of taxation that provoked serious unrest. And by the end of his reign, Emperor Wu issued an extraordinary public document, the Repenting Edict of Luntai, in which the Emperor of China formally admitted that his wars had exhausted the people and announced that the policy was over. Now watch Rome in the same century, doing the mirror image. In the year 146 before Christ, 5 years before Emperor Wu was born, Rome destroyed Carthage and Corinth in the same year, obliterating its greatest western rival and its most prestigious eastern one within months of each other, and became the unchallenged power of the Mediterranean. And the wealth of conquest came flooding back into Italy, and it destroyed the Republic. That is not a metaphor. Enormous fortunes made in the provinces bought up Italian farmland into vast estates worked by enormous numbers of captured slaves, which pushed the small farmers who had filled the legions off the land and into Rome as a landless urban population. Politicians who tried to redistribute that land were murdered in the street. Generals began recruiting the landless directly, and those soldiers looked to their commander rather than the state for land and pay, which meant that within a generation, the Roman army was a set of private armies with a state attached. The road from the destruction of Carthage to Caesar crossing the Rubicon is 100 years long, and it is essentially straight. Both empires, in the same century, took the wealth and the power that came from expansion and used it to inflict grievous internal damage on themselves. One bankrupted its treasury, pushing west into the desert. The other dissolved its constitution, digesting what it had already taken. And these two processes, which have nothing whatever to do with each other, are what put a Chinese diplomat and a Roman army on the same road within one lifetime. Take Rome first, because the Roman version of the collapse is the one you already half know, and because there is a detail buried in it that you need to carry with you for the next hour. By the 50s before Christ, the Republic was being run by 3 men in an informal arrangement: Pompey, who had conquered the East; Julius Caesar, who was conquering Gaul; and Marcus Crassus, who was the richest man in the world and had conquered nothing anybody respected. And Crassus, at around 60, wanted a war of his own, and the only unlooted thing left on the map was the Parthian Empire beyond the Euphrates. So, in the year 53 before Christ, he took 7 legions across the river, without provocation and without the Senate's blessing, and marched them into open desert. And at a place called Carrhae, a Parthian force, a fraction of his size, made up of horse archers who would not close, and armored lancers who charged only when the arrows had done their work, destroyed him. Around 20,000 Romans died, and around 10,000 were taken prisoner. And this is the detail. Plutarch says the survivors were marched east and settled in Margiana, which is the oasis of Merv, in what is now Turkmenistan, on the far northeastern frontier of the Parthian Empire. As far from Rome as Parthia could put them. Remember that. 10,000 Roman professional soldiers, alive, at the eastern edge of the Parthian world, 400 miles closer to China than any other Romans on earth. We are going to come back for them. Carrhae took one leg off the 3-legged stool, and the rest followed fast. Caesar and Pompey went to war with each other. Caesar won. Caesar was murdered by senators in the name of the Republic, and the Republic then died completely in the wars that followed. Until in the year 31 before Christ, Caesar's heir Octavian defeated Antony and Cleopatra at Actium and was left holding the entire Roman world alone. And what he did with it was the greatest political conjuring trick in history. In 27 before Christ, he stood in the Senate and announced that he was restoring the Republic, handing back his powers, returning the state to the Senate and people of Rome. They begged him to keep some responsibilities. He graciously accepted a few and kept accepting a few more for the next 40 years until he controlled the army, the treasury, the provinces, and the succession, and had a name that meant revered one, Augustus, and no title that meant king. The Republic was formally intact and functionally dead, and by the time everyone who remembered the difference had died, the monarchy was simply the way things were. Now go east and watch the Han court do it the other way round. The Han did not have a constitutional problem. It had a family problem, and the family problem ate the dynasty twice. The mechanics are these. An emperor takes an empress from a powerful family. That family becomes enormously influential at court. If the emperor dies young, the empress becomes dowager and the regent for a child emperor, and her male relatives run the government. The child emperor grows up in a palace, surrounded by his mother's relatives, whom he cannot trust. And the only people around him who have no families of their own, and therefore no clan interest to serve, are the eunuchs. So when he comes of age, he uses the eunuchs to destroy his in-laws. The eunuchs then become the dominant force at court. He dies, often young. Another child succeeds. Another consort clan takes over, and the cycle runs again, each turn more violent than the last. That loop ran for the whole later history of the dynasty, and it is a machine for producing weak emperors and murderous courts, and the first time it broke the empire outright was at the turn of the millennium, when a nephew of an empress dowager named Wang Mang accumulated every office in the state, ruled as regent for a series of infant emperors, and finally, in the year 9 after Christ, took the throne himself and declared a new dynasty. The year 9 after Christ, because in that same year, on the other side of the world, in a forest in Germany, 3 Roman legions under Publius Quinctilius Varus were ambushed and destroyed over 3 days by a coalition of German tribes led by a man who had been raised in Rome, held Roman citizenship, and served as an officer in the Roman army. Around 20,000 men were killed. Augustus, according to Suetonius, went for months without cutting his hair or beard and would beat his head against a door calling for Varus to give him back his legions. The empire abandoned the conquest of Germany permanently, and the frontier stopped on the Rhine, where it stayed for 400 years. The same year the Roman Empire found the limit of its expansion, the Han dynasty was overthrown from inside its own palace. And then, remarkably, both of them recovered. Wang Mang's new dynasty attempted a radical program, nationalizing land, abolishing slavery, reforming the currency, and it collapsed within 15 years amid rebellion and, decisively, a catastrophic flood in which the Yellow River changed course, drowned an enormous area, and displaced millions. Out of the resulting chaos, a member of the old imperial family, Lu Shu, fought his way to the throne and restored the dynasty in the year 25 after Christ, moving the capital east to Luoyang. Historians call the halves the Western and Eastern Han. To the people living in it, the dynasty had died and come back. Rome had done exactly the same thing 80 years earlier with Augustus. Both empires reached a point where the original system had failed completely, and both survived by rebuilding the same state under a founder who claimed to be restoring something. And it is the restored Han, confident, expansionist, and pushing west again, that produces the moment this entire video has been walking towards. But before we get there, I have to explain how the road was built. And the road was built by accident, by a man on a mission that failed, and it is one of the great journeys in human history, and almost nobody in the West has heard of it. Go back to Emperor Wu, at the start of his war against the Xiongnu, around the year 138 before Christ. He had a strategic idea. Somewhere far to the west there was a people called the Yuezhi, who had been beaten by the Xiongnu and driven out of their lands, and whose king's skull, the story went, had been made into a drinking cup by the Xiongnu Chanyu, enemies of my enemy. Find them and propose a war on 2 fronts. The difficulty was that nobody at the Chinese court knew where the Yuezhi had gone, or what lay in between, because everything west of the frontier was Xiongnu country, and beyond that, the map simply stopped. A palace attendant named Zhang volunteered, and left with about 100 men. He was captured by the Xiongnu almost immediately, and the Qian, instead of killing him, kept him. For 10 years, he was given a wife, he had a son, and when he finally escaped, he did not run for home. He carried on west to complete a mission that by then was a decade out of date. He crossed the Pamir Mountains. He reached Fergana, in modern Uzbekistan, a settled kingdom of walled cities whose ruling class descended from the Greek colonists Alexander had left in Central Asia 2 centuries before, and which no Chinese official had ever seen. He went on into Bactria, and finally found the Yuezhi, who had conquered rich country in the south, settled down, grown comfortable, and had absolutely no interest in marching back east to fight the Xiongnu for the benefit of a Chinese emperor they had never heard of. The mission failed. Its entire purpose failed. He started home, was captured by the Xiongnu again, held another year, escaped during a succession crisis, and walked into the Han capital in the year 125 before Christ. 13 years after he had left, with his Xiongnu wife and exactly 1 surviving companion out of 100 men, the court had assumed he was dead for a decade. And then he made his report, and the report is the hinge of this entire story. Because Zhang Qian had spent 13 years looking at a world no Chinese official knew existed, and he described it in detail. The kingdoms of Central Asia, their cities, their crops, their armies, their trade. A country further west called Anxi, which is Parthia, which he reported had walled cities, markets, merchants who traveled thousands of miles, a written language on parchment, and coins stamped with the face of the reigning king. Lands beyond that again, and a detail that changed Chinese policy overnight. That in the markets of Bactria he had seen bamboo and cloth from southwestern China and had asked where they came from, and been told they were bought from traders in India, which meant there was already a route. Goods from China were already reaching Central Asia through the south, without any government involvement, and had been for years, and nobody in the Chinese state had known. The court's reaction was not wonder, it was strategy. If there were organized states out there, they could be allies against the Xiongnu, and they could be markets. And the route to them ran through the heqin corridor, the thin string of oases running northwest between the Tibetan Plateau and the Gobi, which the Xiongnu controlled. So China took it and held it, and this is the physical beginning of the Silk Road. Over the following decades, the Han pushed the frontier out along the corridor, planted garrisons and military farms, extended the walls and beacon towers, founded the great oasis commanderies including Dunhuang, and eventually established the Protectorate of the Western Regions, a chain of Chinese authority running out into the Tarim Basin over the oasis kingdoms. And there is one episode in that expansion that tells you exactly what kind of motive built this road. In his report, Zhang Qian had mentioned that Fergana bred extraordinary horses, larger and stronger than Chinese stock, animals the Chinese came to call heavenly horses, and which were said to sweat blood. Emperor Wu, whose entire war depended on cavalry that could match the Xiongnu, sent an embassy with a load of gold to buy some. Fergana refused, killed the envoys, and kept the gold. So he sent an army 4,000 kilometers to take them. It failed, starved, and came back. So he sent a second, larger army, which after 2 years and a siege forced Fergana to hand over the horses. China fought a war on the far side of the Pamirs over livestock, and the garrisons, roads, and supply chains built to fight it are the eastern half of the greatest trade route in the pre-modern world. Nobody built the Silk Road to trade silk. It was built by an army looking for horses and allies, and the merchants used what the soldiers had already made, which is how most infrastructure in history has happened. Meanwhile, at the other end, Rome was building the western half of the same system, and also not on purpose. When Augustus annexed Egypt in the year 30 before Christ, he acquired the Red Sea ports, and with them, a route that Greek and Egyptian merchants had been developing for a century, and then somebody worked out the monsoon. The winds in the Indian Ocean reverse seasonally, and if you understand the pattern, you can sail from the Egyptian coast straight across open water to southern India in weeks and come back the same way months later, instead of crawling around the coastline for a year. Strabo reports that in his day around 120 ships a year were sailing from the Egyptian port of Myos Hormos for India. That is not exotic trade. That is a shipping lane. And we have the paperwork. A surviving papyrus contract, known as the Muziris Papyrus, records the financing and cargo of a single ship returning from southern India, and modern calculations put the value of that one cargo in the region of 7 million sesterces, enough to buy a very large Italian estate outright. One ship. So by the 1st century after Christ, the road exists in both directions, built at each end by an empire pursuing something else entirely, and connected in the middle by people who had every reason to keep it working, and none whatsoever to introduce the two ends to each other. Which brings me to the mechanism at the very center of this video, and it is the thing that most people get wrong about the Silk Road, so I want to be precise. The Silk Road was not a road that people traveled. Almost nobody went the distance. It was a relay. A Chinese merchant sold silk to a trader in the Tarim oases. That trader carried it to Sogdiana and sold it. A Sogdian carried it to Bactria or Merv and sold it. A Parthian carried it across Iran to Mesopotamia and sold it. A Syrian or Nabatean or Jewish merchant carried it to Antioch, and a Greek shipowner put it on a boat for Italy. Every single one of those men marked it up. Not one of them had any interest in his supplier meeting his customer, and most of them could not have told you what lay 2 links beyond their own leg. Let me make that concrete, because the abstraction hides the human beings in it. Let us follow one bolt of silk the whole way. It starts in a farming household in eastern China, and it starts with women, because sericulture in Han China was domestic work and overwhelmingly women's work, and it was not a hobby, it was tax. The Han state collected part of its revenue from ordinary households in cloth, and bolts of silk of standard width and length circulated as a parallel currency across the empire, used to pay officials and reward soldiers. Because a bolt of silk was a known quantity that did not rot, and was worth the same in 2 provinces. So somewhere in Shandong or Sichuan, there is a household stripping mulberry leaves, feeding trays of worms, killing the cocoons in hot water before the moths can break the filament, reeling a thread so fine that it takes many cocoons to make one, and weaving to a standard the tax collector will accept. That woman is where the road begins. She will never receive anything remotely like what her work is finally worth, and nobody will write down her name. The bolt travels west along the imperial roads to the frontier, and passes out of China at the Jade Gate, near Dunhuang, at the western end of the Hexi corridor. Han soldiers manned the watchtowers along that wall, and because the desert preserves everything, archaeologists have recovered their paperwork on wooden slips, duty rosters, requisitions for grain and arrows, disciplinary records, letters home. Those men watched the caravans leave and had no idea where they ended up. Beyond the gate, the bolt is in the Tarim Basin, passing between oasis cities on the rim of the Taklamakan Desert, Lulan and Kucha, and Khotan and Kashgar, each with its own king, its own language, its own Buddhist monasteries filling up with painted caves, each living entirely on the traffic. Then, over the Pamirs, the hardest section on earth, and down into Sogdiana. And now it is in the hands of the people who actually ran the middle of this road. The Sogdians, based on Samarkand and Bukhara, were the merchant nation of Central Asia, so dominant that their language became the common trading tongue of the entire route for centuries. And we have their private mail, because a bundle of Sogdian letters was abandoned in a watchtower near Dunhuang in the early 4th century and dug out of the sand 2,000 years later. They are not diplomatic documents. They are business correspondence and family letters. One of them is from a woman named Mine, stranded in China with her daughter, out of money and out of patience, writing to her mother and her husband. And she says that she would rather be the wife of a dog or a pig than his. That letter was never delivered either. She is the closest thing we have to an eyewitness from the middle of the world. From Sogdiana, the bolt goes to Merv, across Iran, into Mesopotamia, and then west, across the Syrian desert, where it very probably passes through Palmyra, the caravan city that taxed this trade so successfully that it built colonnaded avenues and temples out in the sand, and, in the 3rd century, an army and an empire of its own. Chinese silk has been excavated from the tombs of Palmyra, which is as close as physical evidence gets to letting you hold both ends of this story at once. Then Antioch, then a ship, then Rome. And what has happened to the price? In China, silk was valuable and ordinary enough to be used to pay taxes and soldiers. In Rome, we have the ceiling that the Emperor Diocletian tried to impose in the year 301, later than our period, but the hardest figure we have. And it prices raw white silk at 12,000 denarii a pound, and silk dyed in imperial purple at 150,000 denarii a pound. The same document caps a farm laborer at 25 denarii a day plus food. A pound of purple silk is on the order of 20 years of a working man's wages. And Rome hated it, in the specific way that societies hate luxuries they cannot stop buying. Seneca wrote that he could see silk garments which protect neither the body nor the modesty of the wearer, in which no woman could honestly swear she was not naked. Pliny the Elder complained about the labor of the whole world being expended so that a married woman might show off her figure, and put a number on the drain. 100 million sesterces a year flowing east to India, the Ceres, and Arabia, never to return. And in the year 16 after Christ, the Roman Senate formally banned men from wearing silk on the grounds that it was effeminate and disgraceful, which is a law that only gets passed because enough Roman men were doing it. Nobody on that road walked its whole length. But the bolt did, and every leg was carried by someone with a family and a debt and a language, who had no idea they were one link in a chain with two empires on the ends of it. And one more thing went east down that road. 17 years before the first silk went west, 10,000 Roman prisoners, taken at Carrhae, marched to the far edge of Parthia and settled at Merv. Hold on to them. In about 20 minutes they are going to turn up somewhere they have absolutely no business being. First though, look at who was standing in the middle of the map, because the middle of this map is not empty and it is not passive. Directly between the two empires sat Parthia, holding Iran and Mesopotamia, an empire built on horse archers and on tolls. Parthia's wealth came from its position. Everything moving overland between China and the Mediterranean crossed Parthian territory and paid Parthian charges, and Parthia's single most valuable asset was not a province. It was the fact that Rome and China could only see each other through Parthian hands. And south of the Sogdians, across Bactria and down into northern India, there was a fourth power that almost nobody has heard of. The Yuezhi, the same refugees Zhang Qian had gone looking for, had settled, absorbed the Greek kingdoms Alexander left behind, and built themselves into the Kushan Empire, which at its height ran from the Aral Sea to the Middle Ganges. The Kushans sat exactly where the north, south, and east-west routes crossed. They controlled the passes down into India, which is where the sea route to Rome began. They minted gold coins on a Roman weight standard using melted Roman gold, which tells you precisely where their bullion came from. And their king Kanishka patronized Buddhism. At the exact moment it began traveling north into Central Asia and from there into China, which means the religion that would reshape East Asia moved along this road and paid the same tolls as the silk. So the middle of the world was not a void. It was two large, sophisticated, well-governed empires whose prosperity depended on being the middle. And the Chinese worked out what that meant. They wrote it down. In the Hu Han Shu, the official history of the later Han, in the section describing Da Qin, which is Rome, there is a sentence that says the rulers of Da Qin always wanted to send embassies to the Han, but that Angxi, that is Parthia, wished to control the trade in Chinese silk, and therefore blocked the route and would not let them through. That is not a modern historian's theory. That is the Chinese government's own explanation in its own history for why the two ends of the earth never spoke. And the reason they knew it is a man they sent west to find out. His name was Ying, and to understand how he got as far as he did, you have to meet his commander, because Ban Chao is one of the most remarkable people in Chinese history, and he barely registers in the West. Ban Chao came from an extraordinary family of scholars. His brother Ban Gu wrote the official history of the Western Han. His sister Ban Zhao completed it after their brother died in prison, and became the most famous woman scholar in Chinese history. Ban Chao himself started as a copyist, transcribing documents for a government office, and one day, according to the story, he threw down his brush and said that a man of spirit ought to win distinction in a distant land, rather than grow old among pens and ink. He went west, and he stayed for 30 years. With absurdly small forces, sometimes a few dozen men, he detached the oasis kingdoms of the Tarim Basin from Xiongnu influence one after another, by diplomacy, by bluff, by hostage-taking, and on at least one famous night, by burning a rival Xiongnu embassy's camp and killing them in the dark before the local king could decide which side to back. By the 90s after Christ, he was Protector General of the Western regions. Han authority reached further west than it ever had before or would again for 600 years, and he was, for a brief window, in a position no Chinese official had ever occupied, which was near enough to the west to touch it. And in the year 97 after Christ, Ban Chao sent his officer Gan Ying west with orders to reach Da Qin. Gan Ying went. He crossed Central Asia. He entered the Parthian Empire, traveled its length, passed through Mesopotamia, and arrived at a place the Chinese called Tiaoji, on the coast, which is almost certainly the head of the Persian Gulf. And there he stopped, because ahead of him was water, and he needed a ship. And he asked the sailors on that coast what the crossing to Da Qin involved. Here is what he was told, as the Ho Hanshu records it. The sea is vast and great. With favorable winds, it is possible to cross in 3 months. But if you meet slow winds, it may take 2 years. That is why those who go to sea take 3 years of provisions. There is something in the sea that makes a man long for his home, and several have died of it. And Gan Ying turned around and went home. Now, every part of that report is technically defensible, and together it is devastating, which is the signature of a good lie rather than a crude one. The voyage from the head of the Persian Gulf around Arabia and up the Red Sea to Egypt genuinely is long and genuinely is seasonal, and against the monsoon it genuinely is a nightmare. Homesickness that kills men is a sailor's story of the kind every port on earth has. Nothing in it is a flat invention. It is all true in the way a thing can be true and still be told to you for the specific purpose of making you stop. And what those sailors did not mention is the overland alternative. Gan Ying was standing in Mesopotamia. From there, up the Euphrates to the Roman frontier in Syria, is a journey of a few weeks along a route that carried caravans continuously, in both directions, every year. He did not need a boat at all. He was closer to a Roman province than Chicago is to Denver. He was told a story about a 3-year sea voyage, and he wrote it down, and he turned around and went 4,000 kilometers back the way he had come. So ask the question the Chinese eventually asked. Who told him? Parthian sailors, on a Parthian coast, in an empire whose entire prosperity rested on being the middleman for Chinese silk. A direct Chinese embassy to Rome, followed by a direct Roman embassy to China, followed by any kind of standing arrangement between them, would have taken the largest single revenue stream in the Parthian economy and set fire to it. We are not even guessing at the motive, because the Chinese wrote the motive into their own history books in that flat sentence about Anxi blocking the route to keep the silk trade. They understood exactly what had been done to them. They just understood it afterwards. And now, sit with the counterfactual for a moment, because it is the most tantalizing near miss in recorded history. The year is 97 after Christ. Rome is 1 year away from the accession of Trajan, and within 20 years, Roman armies will be standing on the shore of that same Persian Gulf. The Han Empire is at the furthest western reach it will ever achieve. There is a Chinese ambassador, carrying imperial authority, sitting on a beach a few weeks' travel from a Roman governor. Both empires run professional postal systems. Both maintain formal diplomatic relations, with treaties and protocols and resident envoys, with every single power they can physically reach. Neither has any reason to be hostile to the other, and every reason to be curious. 2 months of travel separates the world in which Rome and China exchange embassies, compare maps and calendars and astronomy, argue about the price of silk, and know each other's names, from the world we actually got, in which each remained a rumor to the other for another 1,500 years. And it came down to a conversation on a shoreline that probably took an afternoon. Ban Chao retired in the year 102 after Christ and died the same year, an old man, at home. Chinese control of the western regions began slipping almost immediately, and within a generation, the corridor was closing again. The window shut, and it did not reopen. So what did they actually know about each other in the end? And this is where it gets strange, because both of them wrote descriptions, and both descriptions are wrong in the same revealing way. The Roman version comes through geographers and natural historians. Their name for the Chinese, Ceres, just means the silk people. Virgil thought silk was combed off the leaves of trees. Pliny the Elder reported that the Ceres scraped the down from leaves and wetted it and spun it, and he was not being fanciful. He was reporting the best available information in the capital of the world. He also described them as mild in manner, but resembling wild animals, in that they shunned the company of the rest of mankind, and waited for trade to come to them, leaving goods on a riverbank for buyers who came later, so that nobody ever met anybody. Ptolemy, the greatest geographer of the ancient world, built the far east of his map from merchants' itineraries, and placed a city called Sarah Metropolis at the end of the land route, and a port called Katagara at the end of the sea route, and everything east of India on his map is badly deformed, because his sources had never been there either. Now the Chinese version, which is far more remarkable, the Ho Han Shu's account of Da Qin draws on a report submitted around the year 125 by a frontier general, and it says this: "The people of that country are tall and honest and resemble the people of the Middle Kingdom, and that is why it is called Great Qin. The land produces gold, silver, and rare jewels. They have walled cities with streets on a grid and post stations along the roads, and their kings are not permanent. Worthy men are selected to rule, and if disaster strikes the kingdom, an unseasonable storm, an untimely rain, the king is deposed and replaced, and the man dismissed accepts his dismissal without complaint." Read that again, because it is not a description of Rome. No Roman emperor was ever peacefully removed because of bad weather. What it describes is the Chinese doctrine of the mandate of heaven, in which a ruler who governs badly forfeits his right to rule, and natural disasters are the visible sign of it. The Chinese, receiving fragments of information about a great empire at the western end of the world, filled the gaps with the best possible version of their own political philosophy. They imagined Rome as the place where the mandate of heaven actually worked. And Rome, receiving fragments about China, imagined a people so serene and self-sufficient that they had no interest in the rest of humanity. Each empire looked 5,000 miles into the dark and saw an idealized reflection of itself. But there are 3 occasions where somebody claiming to come from Da Qin actually turned up in China, and if you have heard anything at all about this subject, you have probably heard about the second one, so let us take them seriously and in order. The first is the year 120. A king in what is now Burma sent a gift to the Han court, and the gift was a troupe of entertainers, musicians, conjurers, and acrobats who could breathe fire, dismember, and reassemble themselves in the way stage magicians do, and juggle many balls at once, and these performers said they came from Da Qin. Hellenistic entertainers genuinely did travel the Indian Ocean routes, and there were Greek-speaking communities scattered across the East, so a troupe from somewhere in the Roman East working its way to a Burmese court is perfectly plausible. It is also perfectly plausible that Da Qin was the most impressive origin available, and they used it, because performers have always done that. The second is the famous one. In the year 166, envoys arrived at the Chinese province of Rhine, on the coast of what is now central Vietnam, saying they had been sent by Andun, the king of Da Qin, and presenting tribute of ivory, rhinoceros horn, and tortoise shell. Andun is an excellent phonetic rendering of Antoninus, and the Roman emperor in the year 166 was Marcus Aurelius Antoninus. The name fits, and the date fits, and this is routinely presented as the first Roman embassy to China. It almost certainly was not, and the giveaway is the gifts. Ivory, rhinoceros horn, and tortoise shell are not Roman products. They are the standard high-value commodities of the Southeast Asian and Indian Ocean trade, which is to say they are exactly what a merchant arriving from that region would already be carrying. A genuine imperial embassy from Rome would have brought Roman things, the glass and metalwork and dyed textiles that Chinese sources elsewhere specifically list as the products of Da Qin. The Chinese historian himself notes the tribute was not precious, and remarks that the account may be exaggerated. The consensus is that these were private traders, probably Greek-speaking subjects of the empire, who reached a Chinese port, understood that presenting themselves as an embassy from the Great Western Empire would get them an audience, hospitality, and access to a market, and did so. That is not contact between two empires. That is a sales technique. The third is the year 226, after the Han dynasty had already fallen, when a merchant of Da Qin named Qin Lun arrived at Jiaoji and was sent north to the Court of Sun Quan, one of the three kings then dividing China, who questioned him closely about his country and its customs, and then sent him home with an escort. That is the closest thing to a genuine meeting in the entire record, and it is one traitor talking to a regional king, 6 years after the dynasty this video is about had ceased to exist. So how much of all this can we actually trust, and what is the check on it? The written sources at both ends are working from hearsay, and the check is dirt. The archaeology is unambiguous about the goods. Roman glass, which was the technological marvel of the Mediterranean, and which China could not make to the same standard, has been excavated from Han period tombs, including in the far south, arriving by sea. Roman gold and silver coins have been found by the thousand in southern India, the halfway house of the entire system, exactly as you would expect if Rome was settling its eastern trade deficit in bullion. Chinese silk has been recovered from graves at Palmyra in the Syrian desert. The goods traveled. Nobody disputes the goods. What the archaeology has never produced, anywhere, is a person. There is no Latin inscription in China, no Roman burial, no Roman coin hoard of the Indian type, no Chinese document naming a Roman official, nothing in the Roman record naming a Chinese one. 4 centuries of the largest trade network in the pre-modern world, and we have the parcels and not one confirmed postman, which is exactly the shaped hole that the best story in this entire subject fits into perfectly. So let us do it properly, because this is the one you came for. Go back to Carrhae in the year 53 before Christ, and to those 10,000 prisoners. Rome lost around 20,000 dead in that battle, and about 10,000 captured, and Plutarch says the survivors were settled in Margiana, the oasis of Merv. And that was standard practice, not cruelty. You do not keep 10,000 enemy professional soldiers near the frontier they came from, where they can escape home or be rescued. You march them to the far side of your empire, give them land, and put them to work garrisoning a frontier against somebody else. And the frontier at Merv faces Central Asia. So from about the year 50 before Christ, there is a community of trained Roman heavy infantry living at the northeastern edge of the Parthian world. They are the closest Romans on the planet to China, by a margin of hundreds of miles, and they are sitting directly on the road that Zhang Qian's mission had opened one human lifetime earlier. Now, jump forward 17 years and 2,000 kilometers east. In the year 36 before Christ, a Chinese army marched deep into Central Asia to destroy a renegade Xiongnu leader named Zhiji, who had broken from his brother, murdered a Han envoy, and built himself a fortified capital far to the west on the Talas River, in what is now Kazakhstan. The expedition was launched by 2 officers, Chen Tang and Gan Yanshou, essentially without authorization, on orders Chen Tang forged himself, which is its own extraordinary story, and which they were later both punished and rewarded for. They marched. They found the town. They stormed it and killed Zhiji. And the report of that assault was written up and survives in the Han Shu, the official history of the Western Han, compiled by Ban Gu, brother of the general we met earlier. And in that report, there are 2 details that have been driving people slightly mad for 80 years. The first is that Zizi's town was protected by a double wooden palisade outside the earthen wall. The second is that as the Chinese approached, more than 100 foot soldiers were drawn up on either side of the gate in a formation the text describes as being like fish scales. A double timber palisade is not how steppe peoples fortify. It is, however, precisely how a Roman army fortifies a camp, and Roman armies did it every night as a matter of doctrine. And a body of infantry drawn up so that they overlap like the scales of a fish is, if you are already thinking about Romans, a testudo, the tortoise, shields locked front and overhead. In 1941, an American sinologist at Oxford named Homer Dubbs put those 2 observations together and published the theory that has refused to die ever since. The men at Zhiji's gate, he argued, were Carrhae prisoners or their sons, who had drifted or been sold or recruited eastward out of Parthian service across 17 years and ended up as mercenaries for a Xiongnu warlord. And he went further. The Chinese, he noted, took prisoners at Jiji, around 145 of them by his reading, and Han practice with useful captured soldiers was to settle them on a frontier as a military colony. And in the Han administrative records for the Heqin corridor, in Gansu, there is a county with a name that leapt out at him, Liqian, because Liqian, in Han period Chinese, was a term used for the Greco-Roman world, for Alexandria, for the West, for Rome. A county named after Rome, in the Chinese desert, in exactly the region where the Han state settled, surrendered foreign soldiers, appearing in the records around the right time. And it gets better, because the place still exists. In Yongchang County in Gansu, there is a village where a local tradition says the inhabitants are descended from foreign soldiers who came long ago, and where a noticeable number of people have light brown or reddish hair, green or blue eyes, prominent noses and tall builds. In the 2000s, this went global. Chinese and international media ran the story. Genetic testing was carried out at Lanzhou University in the mid-2000s and was reported as showing a substantial Western Eurasian component in the sampled villagers. A Roman-style pavilion was built. A statue of a legionary went up. Tour buses arrived. A village in the Gobi became, for a few years, the lost legion of Crassus. I would love it to be true. It is not. And here is how a good story dies. Start with the name, because the name was the strongest pillar, and it is the one that collapses hardest. Dubs argued that Liqian County was named for the Westerners settled there after 36 before Christ. The difficulty is that the county appears to have existed before then. The administrative record places its establishment in the westward expansion of the Heqin corridor decades earlier, when there were no prisoners from Ziji to settle anywhere. And the word itself was already in general use as a Chinese label for the far western world. A county in the far west of China, being given a name meaning the far west, is not evidence of Romans. It is evidence of geography. Then, the battle description. A double wooden palisade is a sensible fortification, and it is not uniquely Roman, and Chinese armies used timber palisades themselves. A cornered warlord at the edge of the settled world building the strongest defenses he can think of is not proof that he had Roman engineers. And the fish scale formation rests on a single translated phrase in one military report, and fish scale is a common Chinese descriptive term for overlapping ranked arrangements of all kinds, used of ships, of troops, of clouds in the sky. Historians who work primarily in the Chinese sources, rather than the Roman ones, have been skeptical of the testudo reading from the beginning. Then, the geography. It is a very long way from Merv to the Talus River, and while men certainly could cover it over 17 years, the theory requires a specific unbroken chain. Prisoners transferred to the eastern edge of Parthia, then leaving Parthian service, then crossing into Sogdiana, then taking employment with a fugitive Xiongnu chief, and there is no evidence for any single step of it. Each link is plausible on its own. The chain is a construction, and then the genetics, which is what settled it. In 2012, a team of researchers published a study of the Y chromosome lineages of the Liqian villagers and found the population overwhelmingly East Asian in origin, with the Western Eurasian component small and entirely consistent with the ordinary background level found right across the Heqin corridor, which is exactly what you would expect. And it is not a boring answer at all, because the Heqin corridor is the Silk Road. It is a 2,000-year-old transit route along which Sogdians, Persians, Tocharians, Turks, Indians, and Central Asians of every description traveled, traded, garrisoned, married, and settled. Century after century. A village in Gansu, with some Western ancestry, is not a mystery that requires a lost legion. It is the normal result of living for 2 millennia on the busiest road in Asia. The blue eyes are real. They are just not Roman. So the legend is dead, and I have spent 10 minutes killing it, and I want to say plainly why it was worth doing. Because the reason this story will not die tells you something true about the subject. We want the two ends of the world to have touched. That desire is so strong that it survived a county name that does not work, a translation that does not hold, a chain of events with no evidence at any link, and a genome that says no, and it is still on the tourist signage in Gansu today. And the real history of Rome and China is the story of exactly that desire, being frustrated over and over for 4 centuries by middlemen and distance, and the plain fact that neither government ever wanted it enough. The myth is the wish. The history is the wish not coming true. And then the window closed at both ends at once. And that is the last thing we have to look at, because the way these 2 empires died is the strangest rhyme in the whole video. Watch the Chinese collapse first. From the middle of the 2nd century, the Han court is consumed by the loop we described earlier. Consort clans against eunuchs, with emperors increasingly young, short-lived, and irrelevant. Until in the year 189, a general sent to settle, it massacred 2,000 eunuchs in the palace, and the capital dissolved into a war between warlords. Underneath the court politics, something worse was happening to the machine. Great landholding families were accumulating estates and taking peasants onto them as dependents, off the tax registers. And you can watch it happen in the state's own numbers, because the Han kept counting. The registered population, which had been 57 million at the start of the 1st century, falls catastrophically over the 2nd. And while epidemics and war account for part of it, a large share of that fall is not death. It is people disappearing from the state's books into private estates, where their labor benefits a landlord rather than the treasury. The empire's revenue collapses, while its population does not, which is the exact fiscal wound that killed Rome 300 years later. Then disease. Severe epidemics sweep China repeatedly from the 60s of the 2nd century onward. The physician Jing, writing the preface to the medical text that made him famous, says that of his own clan of more than 200 people, 2/3 died within about 10 years, most of them of fever. And out of that misery came a mass religious movement. And in the year 184, a Taoist healing sect launched a rebellion across 8 provinces at once. The Yellow Turbans, whose members treated illness with talismans and confession, and who believed the age was ending. To crush it, the court granted emergency military powers to regional commanders, and the regional commanders won and then declined to give the powers back. By the year 190, the capital had been burned, and the emperor was a puppet passed between warlords. In 220, the last Han emperor abdicated, and China divided into 3 states and stayed broken, with brief interruptions, for the better part of 400 years. Now watch Rome, and you have seen this list already. In the year 165, a plague arrives with soldiers returning from a campaign in Mesopotamia and burns through the empire for 15 years and kills a large fraction of the population. From the 230s, the emperors are murdered every couple of years by their own soldiers. The currency is debased until it is worthless. Entire regions break away under their own rulers, and the empire spends 50 years in a crisis. It survives by inches. Underneath it, exactly as in China, the fiscal base narrows as great estates absorb small farmers, and the state finds it harder every decade to tax what its own subjects produce. The 2 collapses are not identical. The shape is unmistakable, and the timing is close enough to demand the question, is it a coincidence? I am not going to pretend to know, but there are 2 real mechanisms, and both are argued seriously by people who know far more than I do. The first is disease. Rome's Antonine Plague and China's 2nd century epidemics overlap in time. Whether it is the same pathogen moving along the same trade network that carried the silk is unproven, and probably unprovable with current evidence, and specialists differ. But the network existed, the goods moved every year, and a pathogen does not need a diplomat. Everything else got through. The second is the steppe, and this one has the better paper trail. The Han offensives and the internal splits broke the Xiongnu Confederation, and the northern Xiongnu were driven west during the 1st and 2nd centuries, and then vanished from Chinese records. Roughly 2.5 centuries later, a people called the Huns appear on the edge of Europe, and the migrations they set off break the Western Roman Empire. Whether the Huns were the northern Xiongnu or descended from them, or an entirely different confederation that took over the same territory and the same name, has been argued for 250 years, and the linguistic and genetic evidence is suggestive rather than conclusive. What is not in doubt is that both empires spent their strength on the same grassland, and that a shock delivered at one end of that system is felt at the other, eventually. So the two empires that never managed to exchange a letter may well have shared a plague and a set of enemies, and each may have been shaped, at second hand and without ever knowing it, by the other one's wars. So let us close the loop we opened at the beginning. Rome and China knew about each other, traded for 4 centuries, and never met. Why? Not distance. I hope Gan Ying on that beach has killed distance for you, because the last stretch separating a Chinese ambassador from a Roman province was a few weeks of ordinary caravan travel on a road that carried traffic every year. The first reason is the one the Chinese identified themselves. Everybody in the middle was making a living out of the fact that the two ends could not see each other. Parthia overland, the Kushans, and the shipping states of the Indian Ocean to the south. Rome did not know what silk cost in China. China did not know what silk sold for in Rome. Everyone in between knew both numbers, and the difference between those two numbers was their entire livelihood. This is not a conspiracy. It is what middlemen are, and it is the oldest business model in the world. And it was still doing exactly the same job 1,500 years later, when Venetian and Arab traders declined to tell European buyers where the spices actually grew. The second reason is less satisfying, and probably more important. Neither empire ever had a strategic motive strong enough to force the issue. Think about what a great power actually wants from a foreign relationship. An ally against a common enemy, or a threat deterred, or control of a trade it is losing money on. Rome and China could not usefully ally against anything, because no army either of them possessed could reach the other's enemies inside a year. Neither could ever threaten the other. And the trade already worked, privately, with no state involvement whatsoever, and the goods arrived every year regardless. Han foreign policy was about the Xiongnu, and then the Qian, and then the Xianbei, because those people could burn Chinese towns. Roman foreign policy was about Germans and Parthians for the same reason. A superpower 5,000 miles away that can neither help you nor hurt you is not a foreign policy priority. It is a curiosity, and states do not spend money on curiosity. And the third reason is buried in the structure of the trade itself. Nobody in the chain had any incentive to travel the whole road because there was no money in it. The profit was made at the transfer, and a merchant who spent 2 years going end to end would have paid every cost of the entire route and collected the markup of a single leg. The relay was not an obstacle to through travel. The relay was the business, and through travel was the thing that would have destroyed it. Put those together, and you get an answer stranger than a conspiracy and stranger than distance. Rome and China did not fail to meet because it was impossible. They failed to meet because a large number of perfectly rational people, each acting sensibly in their own interest, produced a world in which the meeting never quite paid for itself. The two largest empires in human history were kept apart by economics, which is the point at which I want to break the rules of this channel for about 5 minutes, because you cannot look at a near miss this close without asking what would have happened, and I think there are 4 questions worth asking. This next part is speculation, and I am labeling it as speculation, and I will tell you where I think the honest answer is boring. First, what if Gan Ying gets on the boat, or better, takes the road up the Euphrates? He reaches a Roman frontier province, probably Syria, and is passed up the chain because Roman governors did not sit on something like this. And Rome's reaction to a Chinese embassy would have been enthusiastic because Rome loved this. An embassy from the furthest edge of the world was a political trophy, and Augustus had put embassies from India on his public monuments for exactly that reason. So you get a Chinese embassy received at Rome and a Roman embassy sent back with it, and here is the thing that actually matters. Both sides find out the price of silk. And that is a catastrophe for Parthia. Not immediately and not completely, because geography does not change and the goods still have to cross Parthian ground. But the mystique is gone. The ends can negotiate, and the sea route through the Red Sea in India suddenly has an obvious use as a way around the Parthian toll booth. My honest guess is that direct contact would have accelerated the maritime route by a century or more, and that the loser is Parthia. Quietly, over decades. Second, and this is the big one, could they have allied? On paper, it is the most logical alliance in the ancient world. Rome spent 700 years failing to conquer the empire in between, and I have a whole video on exactly how badly that went. The Huns spent 2 centuries trying to control the western routes, and were blocked by the same region's politics. Both had a direct interest in the middle being weaker. And in practice, it is almost impossible. And the reason is signaling speed. A message travels at best a year one way. Coordinating simultaneous offensives from Syria and the Tarim Basin against an enemy in the middle with a 2-year round trip on every decision is not a strategy, it is a prayer. Add that emperors at both ends died and policies reversed on timescales shorter than the message cycle, and you get the real answer, which is that they could have signed something magnificent and never once acted on it together. The alliance is a fantasy of the map, not of the road. Third, and this is where it gets genuinely interesting, what crosses if the door is open? Not soldiers, ideas and tools, and the traffic is lopsided. Going west? The 2 that matter are paper and the blast furnace. Paper reaching the Mediterranean in the 2nd century rather than the 12th would put cheap writing material into the most literate, most legally minded, most bureaucratic society in the West at the moment it was at its height. And I would argue that is the single largest counterfactual in this entire video, because the limiting factor on Roman administration was the cost of recording things. Cheap paper is more Roman documents, more copies of everything, and a far better survival rate for a literature we have mostly lost. And industrial cast iron in a society that already had water power and standardized production is not a small thing either. Going east, the strongest candidates are Roman concrete and Roman glass, and probably Greek geometry and mechanics through Alexandria. That last one has the most interesting shape, because Han China was extremely strong on observational astronomy and instrumentation, and comparatively weak on formal deductive geometry, which is exactly the thing Greek mathematics was best at. But before anyone gets carried away, the honest break. Technology does not travel just because a road exists. It travels when someone has a reason to adopt it. And the ancient world is full of inventions that were known and ignored for centuries because no one needed them. Both of these societies had abundant labor and no incentive to mechanize. Contact makes the transfer possible. It does not make it fast. And fourth, the grim one. Could they have warned each other? If the plagues of the 2nd century really did move along that road, then the answer is that the road is what brought the disease, and the road would have brought the warning at exactly the same speed. Which is to say, too late. Information moved no faster than the caravans, and the pathogen was in the caravan. The 2 ends could not have helped each other, and if there is a bleak lesson in the ancient world's version of globalization, it is that the network transmitted its costs at exactly the same rate as its benefits. Which brings me to the thing I actually believe about all of this, and it is not about either empire. Contact would have changed what these 2 civilizations knew. I do not think it would have saved either of them. Both collapsed for reasons that were entirely internal. Fiscal exhaustion, a narrowing tax base, armies that stopped answering to the state, disease, and a court or a senate that could no longer control the men with the soldiers. Nothing arriving from 5,000 miles away fixes any of that. The great near-miss of the ancient world is a tragedy of knowledge, not of power. And then it ended, and the way it ended is a small, perfect epilogue. 300 years after the Han fell, the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian in Constantinople was still paying Persian middlemen enormous sums for raw silk and still furious about it. And according to the historian Procopius, 2 monks came to him and said that they had lived in the country where silk is made, and that it does not come off trees, it is spun by worms that eat mulberry leaves, and that while the worms cannot survive the journey, their eggs can. Justinian sent them back, and they returned with silkworm eggs concealed, the story says, inside hollow canes, and Byzantium began producing its own silk. A monopoly that had lasted more than 2,000 years was broken, not by war and not by diplomacy, but by the ancient world's most successful act of industrial espionage. By then, the 2 ends had already stopped imagining each other. Chinese knowledge of Da Qin faded into legend and got attached to whichever Western power came next. In Europe, the series slid out of geography and into poetry, and when a Venetian merchant reached the court of a Mongol emperor 1,200 years later and came home describing an ordered, immensely rich civilization that burned black stones for heat and printed its money on paper, The educated opinion of Europe was that Marco Polo was a liar. Europe had known. Europe had forgotten. That is how thin the thread was. So here is where we started, and here is where we have arrived. In the year 150 after Christ, a woman in Rome could wear a fabric woven by a woman in Shandong, and a man in Luoyang could drink from a cup blown in Syria. And neither of them could have told you one true thing about the place the other one lived. Two empires, each holding a quarter of the human race, at their peaks at the same moment, each convinced that somewhere at the far end of the earth there was a great and virtuous empire that was, in some idealized way, a better version of itself. And they were both right, and they never found out. Which leaves the number I asked you for at the start. Over 4 centuries, how many individual people can we confirm made the entire journey between the Roman world and China in either direction? 0. Not a small number. 0. There is not one person in 400 years whom we can confidently place at both ends. The best candidate is Qin Lun, the merchant at the Court of Sun Quan. And he arrives after the Han dynasty is already over, by sea. And everything we know about him is what he told his hosts. That is the entire list. 4 centuries of trade, 2 of the most obsessive record-keeping bureaucracies in human history, and not one confirmed human being who saw both ends of the road. Tell me in the comments what you guessed, and how far off you were. And tell me as well whether you think the plague in the Steppe link is real or coincidence, because I genuinely could not settle it and I want to read the argument. If you got this far, you are exactly the audience these are made for. So hit the like button, and if you are not subscribed, subscribe. Because it genuinely decides whether documentaries this long keep getting made, and if the hype button is showing, press it. It costs you nothing, and it pushes this video to people who would never otherwise see it. And if you want the story of the empire in the middle, the one whose sailors sent Ying home, that video is already on this channel. Rome spent 700 years trying to break Parthia and Persia, captured their capital 4 separate times, had one of its own emperors taken alive and kept until he died, and never held a mile of it. It is the war that made this story impossible. I will see you there.